The moment my mother's voice cracked through the phone that cold November morning, I knew something had shifted beneath my feet, the way the ground tilts in a dream right before you fall. And I stood in my cramped apartment kitchen gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing for impact while the weak sunlight from the single window painted a pale stripe across the chipped tiles, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily in the stale air as if unaware that everything in my world had just begun to vibrate with tension. She spoke with that careful, brittle tone she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable while doing something unforgivable, telling me that perhaps it was better, for everyone. Sweetheart, if I didn't come to Thanksgiving this year. Her words floating through the receiver with that familiar mixture of guilt and polite cruelty. And even though I had felt it coming after last weekend's confrontation with my sister Miriam at our cousin's birthday dinner, hearing it out loud made my throat close, the hurt blossoming deep and hot in my chest as I tried to swallow it. Tried to breathe, tried not to let her hear the break forming in my voice. I asked her what that meant, though I already knew. And she sighed dramatically, as if she were burdened by something I had done rather than the decision she was now making. And she said that Miriam was still upset, that Miriam had cried after I embarrassed her in front of her boyfriend Ethan. And that maybe some space would help things settle. Help the holiday stay peaceful, and for a moment I couldn't speak. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth as the memory flashed through me with brutal clarity. The restaurant balcony lit with warm fairy lights. Ethan's too loud laugh, Miriam's eyes darting nervously every time I glanced her way. The moment she asked me privately, desperately, not to say anything about the bruise on her wrist or the way Ethan had snapped at the waiter, and later that night. How the truth had ignited inside me like a spark. Landing on dry tinder when Ethan tried to joke about women who didn't know when to shut up, his hand tightening on her shoulder while she forced a smile. That was miles from her eyes. I had stepped between them, heat rising in my blood. My voice steady but sharp as a blade as I told him that Miriam wasn't his to belittle. Wasn't his possession, wasn't a toy to manhandle. And the table had gone silent, all those relatives looking back and forth as though something scandalous had just occurred. And Ethan had smirked like he was the victim, leaning back in his chair with an arrogance that stank of entitlement, saying I was misinterpreting things and creating drama, and Miriam had tugged at my arm, eyes wide with a silent plea for me to drop it, to not cause a scene. Because she would rather swallow her own pain than face the storm she feared Ethan would bring later. And now, days after that night, I stood listening to my mother explain that I was the problem. That my intentions, even if they came from concern, had been misplaced. That calling out Ethan had humiliated my sister and caused her stress. And as she talked, I could hear the clatter of dishes in the background. Smell the phantom aroma of spiced roasting nuts and cinnamon from years of Thanksgivings past. And the familiarity of it all intensified the ache that spread through me. Because for the first time in my life, my family had chosen someone else's comfort over my presence. And the betrayal slithered inside me like a cold serpent coiling around my ribs. I managed to respond with a simple okay, though my voice trembled faintly. And she quickly added that she hoped I understood. That I could still come for dessert if things seemed calm, as though she were offering me scraps while the rest of the family feasted. And when she hung up, the apartment fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against my eardrums. And I stared at the blank wall over the sink. The reality of it all sinking in with a painful finality that left me momentarily unable to move. The kettle on the stove whistled suddenly, startling me out of my stupor. And I turned it off with a shaking hand before walking slowly to the small couch by the window, sinking down and pulling my knees to my chest as I tried to make sense of the swirling storm inside me, anger, sadness, confusion, and beneath it all, a fierce, protective love for my sister that pulsed like a bruise every time I imagined her flinching at Ethan's touch. I thought of the way she used to be before him, bright, funny, vibrant, practically glowing with ambition as she talked about her design portfolio and her dreams of moving to New York, and then I thought of the person she had become since meeting Ethan 2 years ago. Quieter, more cautious, shrinking every time he entered a room as though she were trying to fold herself into a shape that would displease him less. And I remembered the first time I noticed the change. The way she had brushed off my questions with that tight, rehearsed smile of hers. The one that always meant she was hiding something she didn't want me to dig into. And I realized with a painful twist that the bruise I'd seen on her wrist last week was not the first, only the first she'd been unable to hide. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat as images flickered through my mind, the way Ethan watched her like she was property. The way he dismissed my concerns with mocking arrogance. The way he tightened his grip on her arm when he thought no one noticed, and suddenly the humiliation of being uninvited felt insignificant compared to the fear that clawed at my insides when I imagined my sister trapped with him. During the Thanksgiving holiday, isolated and cornered inside our parents' house where his temper could flare unseen. I stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room, the worn carpet brushing beneath my feet as I walked back and forth, unable to contain the restless energy that surged through me like a tidal wave, and as I moved, fragments of conversations from the past 2 years echoed in my head, my mother saying Ethan was good for Miriam. My father praising his job, Miriam insisting she was fine, even though her hands trembled when she reached for her purse. Even though she stopped meeting my eyes whenever I asked how things were truly going, and with every recollection, a sharp, simmering anger rose inside me, pushing aside the hurt until all that remained was a singular, focused resolve. A determination that felt like steel hardening within my chest. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and stepped onto the apartment balcony. The icy November wind whipping across my face as my breath clouded in the air. The city below humming faintly with the distant rumble of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights, and I leaned against the railing, gripping the metal bars tightly as I whispered to myself that I wasn't going to let this happen, not again, not this year. Not while my sister's voice trembled every time she said she was happy, not while Ethan walked around with that smug grin like he had already won some twisted game. The memory of his words that night, maybe she should learn to keep things to herself, echoed through my mind with venomous clarity. And I felt my jaw clench, my pulse pounding in my ears. And it was in that moment, standing on the balcony with the bitter wind numbing my cheeks, that I made the silent promise to myself that I would get to the bottom of whatever he was doing to her. That I would expose him if necessary, that I would protect my sister even if my family turned their backs on me entirely. As I stood there breathing in the cold night air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. And when I pulled it out and saw Miriam's name on the screen, my heart seized, a mixture of worry and hope tightening my chest. And I answered quickly, trying to steady my voice as I said her name. But all I could hear on the other end was her shaky breathing, as if she were trying hard not to cry. And I pressed the phone closer to my ear, whispering, "Mari, what happened?" Even though I feared I already knew. She hesitated, swallowing audibly before speaking in a fragile whisper that cracked along the edges. Telling me she was sorry, so sorry, that she never wanted me uninvited. That she tried to tell Mom it wasn't my fault. That she didn't mean to get upset that night but Ethan had been in a mood since then. And he blamed her for how I attacked him. And the way her voice wavered sent a jolt of protective fury rushing through me. But I kept my tone soft, soothing, asking her if she was safe right now. And she whispered that she was in the bathroom at work, trying to calm down, because Ethan had shown up earlier unannounced. Furious that she hadn't gone to his place the night before. And he'd grabbed her arm too hard when she tried to pull away. And she begged me not to say anything to anyone. Not to make it worse, not to confront him again. Because she didn't know what he would do if he got angrier. I felt something hot and sharp twist in my chest, something like fear mixed with rage. And I told her gently, quietly, that none of this was her fault. That she didn't deserve any of it, that I was here for her, always. Even if Mom and Dad refused to see what was happening, and she sniffed lightly, whispering that she wished things could go back to the way they used to be. Back when the only arguments we had were over clothes and who got the last slice of Mom's pecan pie. And something inside me cracked at the sound of that longing in her voice. I wanted to tell her she could leave him, that she should leave him. But I knew that pushing too hard would only make her retreat further. So instead I asked if she wanted to meet me later, someplace quiet, someplace safe. And after a long pause, she whispered yes. That she could come by after work, and I exhaled slowly. Relief and worry threading tightly together inside my chest as I promised her I'd be home. That I'd make tea, that she didn't have to bring anything but herself. When she hung up, I stood on the balcony for several minutes, letting the cold wind wash over me as I pieced together the conversation. Each word a puzzle piece in a dark picture I was only beginning to fully see. And as the sun dipped lower behind the gray clouds, casting long shadows across the city, I knew with a startling clarity that Thanksgiving or not, invited or not, I would be part of whatever came next. Because the story wasn't about a holiday anymore, this was about my sister. Her safety, her freedom, her voice, and no matter what my parents believed. No matter what Ethan pretended to be, I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. When Miriam arrived at my apartment that evening, her small figure hunched beneath her beige coat, rain clinging to her lashes like fragile crystals ready to fall, I recognized instantly that something inside her had cracked further since our phone call. Something essential and shimmering like glass under too much pressure. And as she stepped inside, the dim yellow light from my living room pooling softly around her, she looked smaller than I remembered, as though the world, or more precisely, Ethan, had been carving pieces away from her, slice by invisible slice. She didn't speak at first, just sank onto the couch with trembling hands cupped around the mug of hot tea I placed before her. Steam rising in delicate spirals that danced in the quiet between us, and when she finally lifted her eyes, I saw the truth she'd been trying to hide for months. The bruise on her wrist wasn't the worst of it. Not by far, because the deeper wounds, the ones beneath the surface, had carved themselves into her expression. Her posture, the way her breath hitched every time she thought I might ask too direct a question. But I didn't push, not yet, because the room felt like a fragile pocket of safety she wasn't used to anymore. And I needed her to trust that this was still a place where she could unravel without being judged or rushed. So I sat beside her, close but not touching, letting the silence soften around us until she exhaled shakily and whispered that Ethan had called her 12 times since she left work, each voicemail angrier than the last. Accusing her of running to me to complain, of making him look bad, of not respecting him, and the way she recited his words told me she had heard them countless times before. Their poison sinking into her bones. I didn't realize I was clenching my fists until my nails dug crescents into my palms. But I forced my voice to remain calm, steady, as I asked her gently when things had started getting worse. And she stared down at her tea, the steam fogging her glasses slightly, before whispering that things had been bad for months, though she didn't say the word abusive, not yet. Because naming it would make it real, irreversible, and she confessed that the night I confronted Ethan at the restaurant, he hadn't just been upset, he had screamed at her during the drive home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly she feared his knuckles would tear through the skin, telling her she had humiliated him by letting me speak to him that way, and when they reached his apartment, he had grabbed her by the arm, shoved her inside, and told her that if she ever disrespected him publicly again, he'd make sure she regretted it. Her voice cracked at that point, a small, broken sound. And I felt something primal rise inside me, a scorching protective fire that licked up my spine and burned away every ounce of hesitation I'd been carrying. But I kept my expression soft, my voice low, because she needed comfort, not rage. And I listened as she admitted she hadn't told anyone, not even Mom. Because she knew no one would believe her, not with the polished persona Ethan projected. Not with how much our parents adored him, praising his job, his charm, his perfect manners at family gatherings, all the while missing the dark undercurrents I'd sensed from the very beginning. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her sleeve, whispering that she felt stupid, so stupid, for staying, for excusing the little things that had grown into bigger things. And I gently took her hand, squeezing it lightly, telling her she wasn't stupid, she wasn't weak. That people like Ethan were masters at manipulation. Subtle at first, then bold, then terrifying. And that none of this was her fault. But even as the words left my lips, I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of leaving, the fear of staying, the fear of what he might do next, and I knew that talking wouldn't be enough. That this situation was spiraling toward something dangerous. Something that required action before he escalated beyond threats and bruises. The rain tapped softly against the window, steady and rhythmic. And I realized the night had deepened without either of us noticing. The city outside submerged in darkness broken only by flickers of passing headlights and the distant hum of life continuing beyond our small pocket of crisis. I asked where Ethan thought she was, and she said she had told him she needed space after his outburst. That she was taking a walk, hoping it would buy her a bit of time before he came looking. And I felt another wave of anger churn inside me at the thought of him prowling around, calling and texting until she surrendered to his demands. But before I could speak again, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door, 3 hard, unfamiliar raps that sliced cleanly through the quiet, and Miriam's entire body tensed, her breath halting as her eyes widened with raw fear. And in that instant I knew with icy certainty who stood on the other side. My pulse surged, adrenaline spiking as I whispered for her to go to the bedroom and lock the door. And she scrambled to her feet, nodding frantically before disappearing down the hallway just as the knocking came again. Louder this time, angrier, as if whoever was outside believed persistence was the same as permission. The air in the apartment thickened, humming with the electric charge of danger. And I walked slowly toward the door, my hand hovering over the lock. My heart beat loud in my ears as Ethan's voice bled through the wood, dripping with forced calm. "Hania, I know you're in there. Open the door." His tone sent a shiver up my spine, oily and calculated, pretending politeness laced with unmistakable threat. And for a moment I simply stood there, my breath trapped in my throat, listening as he continued speaking as though we were having a friendly conversation instead of a confrontation dripping with menace. He said he just wanted to clear things up, that Miriam had misunderstood him, as if her bruises were misunderstandings, and he insisted he wasn't angry, just concerned, which only made my skin crawl because people like him always cloak their darkest intentions in concern. I didn't respond, didn't move, just let the silence stretch. And when he finally stopped knocking, the quiet that settled was worse, because it meant he was thinking, calculating, deciding his next move. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay steady, then stepped back and looked through the peephole, catching sight of him standing rigidly in the hallway, jaw tight, chest rising too fast, eyes darting from the door to the corridor as though expecting Miriam to appear at any second. And the longer I watched him, the more I saw the cracks in his mask, the twitch in his jaw, the restless shifting of his weight, the barely contained fury simmering beneath the surface, and I knew he wasn't leaving until he got what he wanted. I stepped away from the door, moving quietly down the hallway toward my room, where Miriam was sitting on the floor beside the bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her breath shallow, her face pale. And when she whispered, "Is he gone?" I wanted more than anything to tell her yes, but I shook my head, kneeling beside her as I explained in a low whisper that he was still there, still waiting, and I watched as her fear deepened into something sharp and trembling. But then, in the midst of her panic, something unexpected flickered across her expression, something like determination, and she whispered that maybe she should just talk to him, just calm him down. But I grabbed her hand gently but firmly, telling her no. That talking to him never de-escalated anything. That giving him what he wanted only emboldened him further, and she looked at me with wide eyes, as if realizing perhaps for the first time that she didn't have to face him alone. I knew then what we had to do. She needed evidence, proof. Something undeniable that our parents or even the police wouldn't be able to ignore. Because as long as it was her word against his charm, he would always win, and I felt my mind sharpening, clicking into place as I formulated the beginnings of a plan. I told her to stay put, to stay quiet, and I returned to the living room just as Ethan knocked yet again, this time his voice sharper, cracking at the edges with frustration as he demanded I open the door. But instead, I called out calmly that I was recording everything he said. And the effect was instantaneous. The hallway went silent, the weight of that silence settling thick and heavy because for men like Ethan, nothing was more terrifying than evidence. After several seconds, he muttered something low and venomous, too muffled for the door to catch fully, and then I heard the echo of his retreating footsteps, fading down the hall until the building swallowed the sound entirely. But I didn't relax, not yet, because I knew he wasn't finished, not by a long shot, and I returned to the bedroom to find Miriam staring at the closed door with trembling hands clenched around her sleeves. She asked if he had left, and I nodded, though I warned her that he'd be back, or worse, that he'd escalate. And I watched as her fear turned into exhaustion, her body sagging slightly as if she had been running from a storm for too long. We spent the next hour talking quietly, piecing together the timeline of his behavior. Every red flag she dismissed, every moment he'd manipulated her, every apology followed by another cycle of cruelty. And as she spoke, I felt the story forming clearly. A pattern unmistakable and urgent. She needed to leave him, but not recklessly, not without protection, and by the time midnight edged close, I had convinced her to stay the night, to turn off her phone, to give herself one evening free from his control. She fell asleep on the couch, curled beneath one of my heavy blankets, the steady rise and fall of her breathing a small relief in the midst of chaos, and I sat beside her, keeping watch. The dark apartment illuminated only by the streetlights below as I listened to the quiet hum of the city and planned what would come next. Morning arrived gray and cold, but with it came a surprising text, one from Ethan's number, but not in his voice, because instead of his usual venom, the message simply said, "We need to talk. I'm done hiding things." And then, shockingly, a second message followed. One that made my blood run cold. "She didn't tell you everything." I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening, because it sounded less like a threat and more like a confession. Something he was ready to weaponize. When I showed Miriam the messages, she paled, whispering that she didn't know what he meant, that she hadn't hidden anything from me, but her eyes flickered with doubt, as though she feared there was some angle he would twist to make her look guilty. I told her not to respond, and when the third message came, "Meet me or I'll come to you," I knew the line had been crossed. We needed leverage, and we needed it now, so I told her we were going to the family Thanksgiving after all. Invited or not, because whatever Ethan planned, he would try to execute it in front of our parents, where he believed his facade was strongest and her will was weakest. But he didn't know that this time she wouldn't be alone. This time I would be there, watching, ready, prepared. Miriam hesitated, fear flickering across her expression. But beneath it was something new, something like courage beginning to unfurl. Shaky but present, and she nodded slowly, gripping my arm as if drawing strength from the contact. The drive to our parents' house felt surreal. The road slick with damp leaves and the sky heavy with unfallen rain, and as we pulled into the driveway, the familiar scent of roasting turkey and spiced apples drifted through the cracked kitchen window, mingling with the faint echo of laughter from inside. A painfully normal backdrop against the storm brewing beneath the surface. When we entered, Mom froze mid-step, her smile flickering into confusion, then discomfort, then something dangerously close to guilt as she glanced between us, clearly recognizing the bruises, the fear, the tension she had chosen not to see before. But before she could speak, Ethan stepped out from the dining room. And for the first time since I'd met him, he didn't fake a smile, didn't feign charm. He looked raw, agitated, cornered. His eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep or too much anger. And he stared at Miriam with a mixture of desperation and accusation, as though she had betrayed him simply by walking in beside me instead of crawling back alone. He approached slowly, hands raised in feigned innocence, telling her they needed to talk, that she had misunderstood what he meant the night before, that he had only been trying to protect their relationship. And his voice trembled faintly, not with remorse, but with fear, the fear of losing control. But before she could respond, I stepped between them, my presence drawing a low murmur from our parents, who hovered nearby with tension thickening the air. Ethan glanced at me with barely concealed disdain, muttering that this was a family matter, but I didn't move, didn't flinch, and instead I said directly, loudly enough for our parents to hear, that he wasn't going to speak to her alone, not now, not ever again. And something in his expression twisted, darkened, before he turned sharply toward my parents, his voice rising as he claimed I had turned Miriam against him, that I was manipulating her, that she had episodes I didn't understand, that she was unwell and overreacting, and he spoke with such conviction that for a moment even the air seemed to hold its breath. But I had anticipated this, had known he would try to flip the narrative, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, pressing play on the recording from the night before, the one capturing his threats muttered outside my door, every venomous syllable echoing now through the previously warm kitchen, draining the color from his face as my parents stared at him in horrified silence. Miriam's breath hitched beside me, her eyes shimmering with a turbulent mixture of shame, relief, and dawning empowerment as she watched the lies crumble from Ethan's expression. And when the recording ended, the room remained painfully silent, until Ethan, in a last desperate move, lunged toward Miriam, sputtering that she had provoked him. But before he could touch her, my father, who had always been gentle, always calm, stepped forward with a force that shocked everyone, shoving Ethan back and telling him with a voice I had never heard before to leave and never come near his daughter again. Ethan stumbled, sputtering curses, but the facade had shattered, and with it, his grip on Miriam, and he backed toward the door, still muttering threats until he finally disappeared into the cold November air. The door slammed behind him, and for a long moment none of us spoke, the weight of everything that had transpired settling over the room like thick fog, until Miriam let out a trembling sob and collapsed into my arms, her body shaking with the release of years of fear. And I held her tightly, feeling something inside her shift, something heavy breaking free. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur, Mom crying, Dad apologizing, relatives whispering, but through it all, Miriam stayed close to me, her hand gripping mine as if anchoring herself to a new beginning. When we finally left that evening, the icy wind sweeping across the darkened street, she looked at me with a quiet strength blooming behind her eyes and whispered thank you, not just for the day, but for not giving up on her when everyone else chose comfort over truth. And as we walked toward my car, the night settling softly around us, I realized that while I had come seeking justice, what we had truly achieved was reclaiming her voice, her freedom, her future, and for the first time in a long time, she stepped into the passenger seat not as someone running from danger, but as someone moving toward something better, toward a life where she no longer had to shrink, or apologize, or fear the man who once controlled her. A life where she knew, without question, that I would always be by her side, uninvited or not, unwanted or not, unapologetically defending her until she learned to defend herself. Thanks for watching.